Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the Elder Lore podcast. This is our inaugural episode, and in honor of the recent release of Skyrim, and I'm sure the number of Game of the Year awards that's headed its way, I figured this first episode should focus on the Nords. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, of course, that happened throughout Nordic history. There's a few rather large things that I'm going to leave out, but maybe later in another episode we can cover those things. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this is a brief crash course in Nordic history. Hopefully you enjoy it. Hopefully it gives you a greater level of immersion when you're playing, and hopefully you keep listening. So here we go. So if we're going to talk about the Nords, we have to start at the beginning. In their own tongue, they've always called themselves the children of the sky. They're humans, and although in recent history they hail from Skyrim, which is the northernmost province in Tamriel, what you might not know is that they were not actually the original inhabitants of Skyrim. That title actually goes to the Aldmer. That's Aldmer, not to be confused with the Altmer. And that's not really much of a surprise because the Aldmer basically ruled the whole world at that time. The Nords originally came from a continent far to the north of Tamriel, which doesn't really appear on any map of Tamriel that you look at, called Atmora. Nobody really knows how long they lived up there for, but eventually conditions up there became too cold and too inhospitable, and the Nords were forced to migrate south. They did not come all at once. They came south in waves throughout the Merethic and the First Eras, so we're talking about 4,500 years before the events in Skyrim. And for a while there, they lived in harmony with the Aldmer, who were already there when the Nords arrived. There was peace between the two of them. It lasted a long time, but eventually the Nord population was growing too fast and too large, and the Aldmer decided it was time to kick them out. There are conflicting reports on how the war actually got started, who fired the first shot, so to speak. But at any rate, a war got started between the Aldmer and the Nords. It was basically a wholesale slaughter of the Nords. And according to the legend, Ysgramor and his two sons were actually the only Nords in Skyrim, which was not called Skyrim at the time, to escape with their lives. They sailed back north to Atmora, and they had plans to kind of curl up and lick their wounds for a while before returning south to retake what they felt was theirs. Now, if you've been playing Skyrim, and you've been doing any of the quests for the Companions faction, you've probably heard a lot about Ysgramor and the 500 companions. Well, this is where they come into it. When all was arranged and they felt like they were ready, Ysgramor and 500 of his best warriors returned south to reclaim the land that really wasn't even theirs in the first place. Even though the Nords were vastly outnumbered, they were in fact able to beat back the Aldmer and conquer Skyrim, which they actually called Mareth at the time. And they were able to kill or drive out all of the Aldmer. Side note, some of those Aldmer that didn't want to leave Skyrim altogether found themselves hiding underground. Years and years and centuries went by, and they lost their eyesight from extended periods of time living in caves, and their skin changed, and they evolved into what we now know as the Falmer. So those Falmer that you find in the caves with their weird-looking swords, those were actually the original inhabitants of Skyrim, or Mareth, when the Nords arrived. So, it was under King Harald, who was a descendant of Isgramor, that Skyrim was unified under the Nords, and the last of the Aldmer had either been killed or had retreated underground. And so this is around the year 143 of the First Era. So, a very long time ago. It is then that the name Mareth kind of vanished along with the elves. So, if you've been playing Skyrim and you've been wondering where these dragon priests are coming from and their Draugr, it is important to say that before the Nords came to Tamriel, and even for a little while afterwards, dragons were an integral part of their pantheon. They both revered and feared dragons, and believed that one day Alduin, the Eater of Worlds, of course, the antagonist of the main storyline in Skyrim, would return to devour all of existence. So the Nords built these great temples in the names of the dragons, who they viewed as kind of god kings, and the most faithful were drafted as these dragon priests and given great power. As time wore on, the dragon priests became more tyrannical, and more powerful, and eventually the general population got scared of how much power they were accumulating and rebelled against them. Some dragons actually joined the side of the general population because they too believed that one day the dragon priests, at this rate, were going to be more powerful than them, and they did not want that to happen. So, in the end, the dragon priests are overthrown, buried in these great crypts, some of which you may have explored in the game, along with all of their followers, who you see now as the Draugr. Now, if you have taken the time to read the book Amongst the Draugr, you can find it in-game. It's written by Bernadette Bantian. There's some very interesting things she says about the Draugr. She basically ingratiates herself with the Draugr in kind of like a Jane Goodall way, and is able to find out a very interesting thing, and that is that nightly the Draugr awake, and they kind of walk together to wherever their respective dragon priest can be found, if it's a sarcophagus or whatever. They kneel in front of it, and in this ritual, they basically funnel their life force into their dragon priest to keep him alive. And that's how these dragon priests, they've never actually been dead. It's very interesting. And by extension, the Draugr themselves have never really been dead either. And of course, once that's done, the Draugr return and, return to their rest. And what Bernadette Bantian thinks is that while they sleep or while they rest, they actually refill whatever life force, whatever small spark of life they have inside them, in preparation for the following night when they would do the same thing. Funnel whatever that spark is into their dragon priest to keep him alive. So eventually, Skyrim is enveloped peacefully into the Empire, and the Nords are introduced to the Nine Divines. Over time, the cult of the dragons kind of fell out of favor. Most Nords did start following the Nine Divines, although over time they have molded it into their own kind of flavor. For example, the Nords' version of Kinnereth, who's the god of the wind, is known only as Kine, and he is much more warlike and aggressive than the Imperial version, who's kind of like a nature lover. Mara is there as well, but she is seen as basically just a handmaiden to Kine, who, according to the lore, Kine is the one who created the Nords. He's the one that breathed life into them at the throat of the world. So the throat of the world is kind of a very sacred place in the Nordic pantheon. And as you well know, if you've been playing, many Nords continued to worship Talos even after his worship was outlawed, when the Empire was taken over the Falmer and the Aldmeri Dominion. More on that later, of course, because that is a totally different story. So, again, not a definitive history of the Nords. There's a lot that I've left out, but this seems to be, to me at least, some of the more important events and things that were going on in the history of the Nords. If you have any questions, or you want to suggest a topic for maybe the next episode, please feel free to visit my blog. You can find it at elderlore.wordpress.com. That's ELDERLORE.wordpress.com. Thanks.